Picture this. It's early June, 1944. The greatest invasion fleet in human history is gathered in the English Channel. Thousands of ships, millions of tons of steel, and over 150,000 men are poised to strike at Hitler's fortress Europe. But the Allied High Command is facing a terrifying mathematical reality. A modern army doesn't just run on courage. It runs on tons. To keep the momentum after the first wave, the Allies need to land 12,000 tons of supplies and 2,500 vehicles every single day. Not every week. Not when convenient. Every single day. There's just one problem. The Germans know this too. Every major deep-water port along the French coast has been turned into a concrete fortress. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Brest. Each one is heavily fortified, mined, and defended by thousands of troops. They are designed to be impregnable. The Allied solution? It was so audacious, so unprecedented, that the German High Command didn't even consider it a possibility. Winston Churchill looked at the map and gave a simple, yet impossible command. If we cannot capture a port, we will bring our own. Today, we go beneath the waves and into the engineering sheds to explore the Mulberry Harbours. The massive, prefabricated artificial ports that bridge the gap between the beaches of Normandy and the liberation of Berlin. This is the story of how Allied engineers built two entire harbors in secret, towed them across the English Channel, and assembled them under enemy fire. It's a story of concrete and steel, of genius and disaster, and of how logistics won the war before the first tank ever rolled off the beach. Welcome to WW2 Battlegrounds, where we don't just tell you what happened, we show you how it was made possible. To understand the Mulberry Harbours, we have to look back at one of the darkest days in Allied military history. August 19, 1942, the raid on Dieppe. The plan seemed straightforward. Launch a surprise assault on the French port of Dieppe, capture it quickly, hold it long enough to prove that the Allies could take a fortified port, and then withdraw. It would be a rehearsal for the eventual invasion of Europe. A test run. It was a catastrophe. Within hours of landing, the Canadian forces were pinned down on the beaches. German machine gun positions overlooked every approach. The harbor defenses were far stronger than intelligence had suggested. Tanks couldn't get off the beach. Reinforcements couldn't land. The raid turned into a slaughter. By the time the survivors were evacuated, over 3,000 Canadians were killed, wounded, or captured. More than half the assault force, destroyed in a single morning. But out of that disaster came a crucial lesson. The Allied planners realized something that would change the entire strategy of the invasion. You cannot capture a heavily defended port from the sea, not without losing so many men that the victory becomes meaningless. And yet, without a port, there was no way to sustain an invasion. A modern mechanized army consumes supplies at a staggering rate. Fuel for tanks and trucks, ammunition for artillery, food for soldiers, medical supplies, replacement vehicles, spare parts. All of it has to come across the water. The calculations were brutal. To break out of Normandy and drive toward Germany, the Allies would need to land at least 12,000 tons of supplies every day. That's the weight of 120 blue whales, every single day, for months. And here's where the Normandy coast presented a unique nightmare. The tides in the English Channel are among the most extreme in the world. The tidal range can reach up to 30 feet. That means a pier that works perfectly at high tide might be standing 30 feet above a dry beach at low tide. Any structure built on the shore would need to somehow accommodate that massive vertical movement twice a day. This is where Winston Churchill entered the picture. And Churchill, for all his faults, had one great strength. He understood that in war, the impossible is just the difficult that hasn't been attempted yet. In May 1942, just months before Dieppe, Churchill wrote a memo that would eventually change the course of the war. He wrote, "Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out." That memo gave birth to one of the most ambitious engineering projects of World War II, Operation Mulberry. The plan was simple to state and nightmarishly difficult to execute. Build two massive artificial harbors in secret in England. Tow them across the English Channel at 4 miles per hour. Assemble them on the beaches of Normandy. And do it all while under potential enemy attack. The two harbors were designated Mulberry A and Mulberry B. Mulberry A would be built at Omaha Beach for the Americans. Mulberry B, which would later be nicknamed Port Winston in honor of Churchill, would be built at Arromanches for the British. But how do you actually build a harbor from scratch? And how do you make it work in one of the most hostile marine environments in the world? The engineers broke the problem down into 3 fundamental challenges. First, you need to stop the waves. Second, you need a stable platform where ships can dock. Third, you need a way to get men and machines from the ships to the shore. Let's start with the waves. The English Channel is not a calm sea. Even in summer, storms can whip up waves that would smash any unprotected anchorage to pieces. To create a harbor, you need a breakwater, a barrier that absorbs the energy of the waves and creates calm water behind it. The first layer of defense was called Operation Gooseberry. The concept was brutally simple. Take old merchant ships and obsolete warships, sail them to the French coast, and deliberately sink them in a line parallel to the beach. These ships would become a permanent artificial reef, breaking up the worst of the wave action. Between D-Day and mid-June, 60 ships were scuttled off the Normandy beaches. Among them were aging battleships, cruisers that had seen action in World War I, and merchant vessels that were too slow or too damaged to be useful anymore. They were positioned carefully, bow to stern, creating a steel wall against the sea. But ships alone weren't enough. They could slow the waves, but they couldn't stop them. The engineers needed something far more massive, something that could stand against the full force of a channel storm. They created the Phoenix Caissons. Imagine a concrete box, not a small box. A box as tall as a 5-story building. A box that weighs 6,000 tons. Now imagine building 147 of them in complete secrecy while fighting a global war. The Phoenix Caissons were hollow concrete structures, heavily reinforced with steel. They came in different sizes depending on where they would be placed. The largest ones were 200 feet long, 56 feet wide, and 60 feet tall. They had chambers inside that could be flooded to sink them and pumped out to raise them. They were built in dry docks all around the British Isles, from Scotland to the Thames, employing over 20,000 workers. The construction had to be done in secret. German reconnaissance aircraft flew over Britain constantly. If the Germans figured out what was being built, they could have bombed the construction sites or prepared countermeasures. So the British disguised the work. They built them in sections. They scheduled construction at night. They spread the work across dozens of sites so no single location looked suspicious. Once a Phoenix was complete, it was floated out of the dry dock and towed to a staging area. There, it would wait with dozens of others until D-Day. The plan was to tow these massive structures across the channel after the initial landings, position them in a line offshore, and then sink them by opening the flood valves. Once sunk, they would form a continuous concrete wall, 6 miles long, creating a sheltered harbor. But a breakwater alone doesn't make a harbor. You still need a way to get the cargo off the ships. This is where the third component came in, the floating roadway system called the whale. The whale was perhaps the most elegant piece of engineering in the entire operation. It consisted of flexible steel roadways supported by pontoon floats called beetles. The roadways were 80 feet wide, strong enough to support tanks and heavy trucks. They stretched from the Phoenix breakwater all the way to the beach. In total, there would be nearly 10 miles of floating roadway across both harbors. But here's the genius part. The roadways weren't rigid. They were connected by telescopic joints that allowed them to flex and twist. As the tide rose and fell by 30 feet, the roadways would rise and fall with it, always staying level with the ships on one end and the beach on the other. The beetles, the pontoon supports, would simply ride up and down on vertical steel pilings driven into the seabed. It was a bridge that could breathe with the ocean. In addition to the whales, the engineers designed a series of floating pierheads called spuds. These were large platforms where Liberty ships and other cargo vessels could tie up and unload directly onto the whale roadways. The spuds were held in place by steel legs that extended down to the seafloor, but could slide vertically as the tide changed. By the time the design was finalized, The Mulberry Harbours represented one of the largest engineering projects ever attempted in wartime. The total amount of steel and concrete used in both harbours was more than was used to build the pre-war naval base at Singapore. It was a staggering commitment of resources at a time when Britain was still being bombed and supplies were desperately short. But Churchill and Eisenhower knew the truth. Without the Mulberries, the invasion would stall. And if the invasion stalled, the war would drag on for years. The Mulberries weren't optional, they were essential. The engineering was only half the battle. Now came the logistical nightmare. How do you move 147 concrete caissons, each weighing thousands of tons, plus hundreds of pontoons, pierheads, and miles of steel roadway across the English Channel during the largest amphibious invasion in history? The answer was tugboats. Every available ocean-going tug in the British Isles was commandeered for the operation. In total, 160 tugs were assigned to the Mulberry towing operation. Some of them were powerful deep-sea salvage tugs. Others were harbor tugs that had never been more than a few miles from shore. All of them were about to attempt the longest tow of their lives. The Phoenix Caissons were particularly challenging. They weren't designed to be towed. They were essentially floating concrete boxes with all the hydrodynamic efficiency of a brick. They wallowed in the waves. They were difficult to steer, and they moved at a painfully slow pace. 3 to 4 knots. That's roughly 4 miles per hour, slower than a person walking. The towing operation began on June 7th, the day after D-Day. While the infantry were still fighting to expand the beachheads, the first waves of tugs began crossing the channel, pulling their ungainly cargo. It took between 10 and 24 hours to make the crossing depending on the weather and the size of the component being towed. The crews were terrified. These slow-moving concrete structures were sitting ducks. If a German U-boat spotted them, a single torpedo could send a Phoenix to the bottom. If the Luftwaffe broke through the Allied air cover, a couple of bombs could wreck months of work. And if the weather turned bad, the tow cables could snap, sending the caissons drifting helplessly. But the Germans were so focused on the fighting at the beachhead that they largely ignored the strange concrete shapes being towed toward the coast. Their reconnaissance didn't understand what they were seeing. The reports described large concrete structures of unknown purpose. The German High Command assumed they were simply additional breakwaters to shelter landing craft. They didn't realize they were looking at entire harbors. By June 18th, both Mulberry Harbours were operational. It was an astonishing achievement. In just 12 days, the Allies had transported and assembled 2 artificial ports, each capable of handling more cargo than a pre-war commercial harbor. Mulberry A at Omaha Beach was actually ahead of schedule. The whales were in place. Ships were unloading. Tanks were rolling off the roadways and heading inland. The Allies were winning what military planners call the Battle of the Build-Up, the race to get more men and supplies ashore faster than the Germans could bring in reinforcements. For the first time since D-Day, the planners began to believe that the invasion might actually succeed, and then nature struck back. On June 19, 1944, the weather in the English Channel began to deteriorate. By the afternoon, the wind had picked up to gale force. The sea, which had been relatively calm for the previous 2 weeks, turned violent. Waves began crashing over the Phoenix breakwaters. The whale roadways started to buck and twist. Meteorologists later determined that it was the worst storm to hit the channel in 40 years. For 3 days, winds reached 30 to 40 miles per hour. Waves topped 10 feet. The barometric pressure dropped like a stone, and there was nothing the engineers could do but watch and hope their designs would hold. This is where the differences between Mulberry A and Mulberry B became critical. The American harbor, Mulberry A, had been built quickly. The Americans had prioritized speed of construction over redundancy. They hadn't sunk their Phoenix Caissons as deeply into the seabed as the British. Some of the anchor cables on the whales were under spec. The American engineers had gambled that the weather would hold long enough to get the harbor fully operational before a major storm hit. They lost that gamble. By the second day of the storm, Mulberry A was coming apart. The whale roadways, lacking sufficient anchoring, began to break free from their moorings. Sections of the pontoon bridge twisted into scrap metal. 20 of the Phoenix Caissons broke loose from their positions and were driven onto the beach or out to sea. Pierheads collapsed. Ships tied up at the docks were battered against the concrete until they sank. When the storm finally passed on June 22, Mulberry A was effectively destroyed. American engineers estimated it would take weeks to repair, and even then it would never operate at full capacity. General Eisenhower made the difficult decision to abandon Mulberry A entirely and focus all resources on keeping Mulberry B operational. But Mulberry B, Port Winston, survived. Why? The British had chosen their site more carefully. The waters off Arromanches had a more favorable seabed composition. The sand and clay mixture allowed the Phoenix Caissons to settle more firmly. The British had also taken extra time to ensure that every caisson was properly ballasted and anchored. They had reinforced the whale roadways with additional cables. And crucially, the natural curve of the coastline at Arromanches provided some protection from the worst of the storm's fury. Port Winston took a beating. Several caissons were damaged. Some sections of the whale had to be replaced. But the harbor held. And when the storm passed, it was still functional. The loss of Mulberry A was a crisis. For several days, the American supply situation was desperate. Supplies had to be landed directly on the beaches using smaller craft, which was slow and inefficient. The buildup of American forces slowed dramatically. But because Port Winston survived, it became the primary supply artery for the entire Allied army in Normandy. British, Canadian, and American supplies all flowed through the single remaining Mulberry. At its peak, Port Winston handled 9,000 tons of cargo per day. Over the course of the next 10 months, it would land over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. Remarkably, even after the Allies captured the port of Cherbourg in late June, Port Winston remained more efficient. Cherbourg had been so thoroughly demolished by the retreating Germans that it took months to clear the wreckage and remove the mines. For most of the summer of 1944, the artificial harbor at Arromanches outperformed every captured natural port in France. So what can we learn from the Mulberry harbors? What lessons does this story hold for us today? First, it redefined the concept of strategic mobility. Throughout military history, armies have been constrained by terrain, rivers, mountains, deserts, oceans. These natural barriers shaped where battles could be fought and where invasions could be launched. The Mulberries proved that with sufficient engineering capability, you could alter the terrain itself to suit your strategy. The Germans had built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that the Allies would need to capture a port. They heavily fortified every port on the coast. They planned to make each one a death trap. And if the Allies did manage to capture a port, the Germans would destroy it so thoroughly that it would be unusable for months. But the Mulberries made that entire strategy obsolete. By bringing their own ports, the Allies could land anywhere along the coast. The German fortifications at Calais, Le Havre, and Cherbourg became irrelevant. The strongest points in the German defensive line were bypassed entirely. Second, the Mulberries demonstrated the critical importance of redundancy in military planning. The original plan called for 2 harbors specifically to provide backup in case one failed. When Mulberry A was destroyed, the invasion didn't collapse. Port Winston carried the load. If the Allies had only built one harbor, and if that harbor had been destroyed in the storm, the entire Normandy campaign might have failed. This principle of redundancy extended throughout the design. Multiple Phoenix Caissons created the breakwater so that if a few were lost, the harbor could still function. Multiple whale roadways meant that damage to one section didn't shut down the entire system. The engineers had designed for failure, knowing that in war, something always goes wrong. Third, the Mulberries were a psychological weapon. When German intelligence finally understood what they were looking at, it was demoralizing. The Allies had solved the unsolvable problem. They had done something the Germans believed was impossible. And if the Allies could build harbors out of thin air, what else might they be capable of? German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, inspecting the Atlantic Wall defenses before D-Day, had famously said, "Believe me, the day on which we lose this war will be the day when the enemy lands, and we are unable to throw him back into the sea." The Mulberries ensured that the Allies would never be thrown back. Once established, the flow of supplies was unstoppable. From a purely technical standpoint, the Mulberries represented some of the finest engineering work of the war. The Phoenix Caissons were marvels of concrete construction. The whale roadways solved a problem that had never been tackled before. The logistics of moving and assembling the components under combat conditions required unprecedented coordination. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: the Mulberries succeeded because the Allies were willing to attempt the impossible. They looked at a problem that seemed to have no solution and refused to accept that. They committed enormous resources to an improvement technology. They took calculated risks, and they succeeded. Today, you can still see the remnants of the Mulberry Harbours. The Phoenix Caissons at Arromanches still sit in the water, now covered in seaweed and barnacles, slowly crumbling after 80 years. They've become a tourist attraction, a monument to ingenuity. But for the people who were there in 1944, the Mulberries were more than an engineering achievement. They were the reason the invasion succeeded. They were the invisible supply line that kept the tanks moving, the guns firing, and the army advancing. Without them, D-Day might have been another Dieppe, a heroic failure that accomplished nothing. The story of the Mulberry Harbours is a reminder that wars are not won solely by the soldiers who storm the beaches or the pilots who rule the skies. They are won by the engineers who solve impossible problems, by the logisticians who move mountains of supplies, and by the planners who think beyond the obvious. The next time you see footage of D-Day, don't just look at the landing craft hitting the beaches. Look out to the horizon. Look for the strange gray concrete shapes sitting in the waves. Those are the Mulberries, the ports that came to the storm, the reason the Allies never stopped advancing until they reached Berlin. If you found this deep dive into the engineering of World War II valuable, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Battlegrounds. Hit that like button if you think the engineers of the Mulberry Harbours deserve more recognition in the history books. And here's a question for you. If the Great Storm had destroyed both Mulberry Harbours instead of just one, do you think the Allies could have continued the invasion using only beach landings? Or would they have been forced to retreat and wait months to try again? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Next time, we're heading to the Eastern Front to examine one of the most brutal urban battles of the entire war. Until then, this is WW2 Battlegrounds, where history meets strategy.